You can open your Bibles to Matthew chapter 6. I'm going to start reading in verse number 5. This is a portion of the Sermon on the Mount, commonly referred to as the Lord's Prayer. We'll talk more about that in a moment. But Matthew chapter 6, verse number 5, the scripture says, "And when you pray, you must not be like the hypocrites, for they love to stand and pray in the synagogues and at the street corners, that they may be seen by others. Truly I say to you, they have received their reward. But when you pray, go into your room and shut the door and pray to your Father who is in secret. And your Father who sees in secret will reward you. And when you pray, do not heap up empty phrases as the Gentiles do, for they think that they will be heard for their many words. Do not be like them, for your Father knows what you need before you ask Him. Pray then like this: Our Father in heaven, hallowed be your name. Your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our debts, as we also have forgiven our debtors. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For if you forgive others their trespasses, your heavenly Father will also forgive you. But if you do not forgive others their trespasses, neither will your Father forgive your trespasses." Like we said last week, there is a similar version of this Lord's Prayer found in Luke 11, where Jesus' disciples come and ask Him to teach them how to pray. Here in Matthew, He's giving this prayer as an example in the middle of a series of warnings against turning religious activity into mere performance. And He comes right at three practices in particular that would tend to be, I think, the most susceptible to hypocrisy, and that is giving to those in need, praying, and fasting. And I say they're the most susceptible to hypocrisy because if you really want people to think that you're something spiritually, then you're going to serve in a soup kitchen or donate to the local food pantry, and you're going to have to tell someone about it. Or you're going to fast, and you're going to have to make sure you look pretty miserable, hoping that someone recognizes you're miserable, asks you about your misery so that you can say, well, you know what, I'm just really serious about my relationship with God. Right? It becomes performance-based religious activity. And Jesus is warning us, don't do that, right? But then there's prayer. And Jesus knows that the temptation for us will be to pray, but really only when people are watching. And then we'll really turn up the performance and the showy language, and language that, if we're really honest, doesn't sound anything like the way we talk to anybody else. Or we sort of ramble on making long prayers because maybe not only are we trying to get people's attention, but we feel like we really have to get God's attention as well. And so we're hoping that not only will people be impressed, but God Himself will be impressed and actually answer us. Because, hey, look how long I spent on this one prayer request, God. And so Jesus gives two examples of the way hypocrites pray. They pray using showy prayers, and they pray using lengthy prayers. And Jesus is like, you don't need either of those things. You do not need to impress people with your praying, nor do you need to impress God with your praying. The reality that we wrestled with last week is that if we pray, or if we only pray, or if the majority of our prayers are only when someone else is watching, then there's a good chance that you are performing rather than communing with God. Part of our issue is, I think, the common understanding of what prayer is in today's mindset is that it is something more closely akin to magic than communion with a God who loves us Because what is magic, right? Magic is long incantations, it's repetition of words for the purpose of trying to enter into the spirit realm and control spirits. Jesus says, don't pray like that because that's how the Gentiles pray. Why? Because they feel like they need to get into the spirit realm and pray enough, do enough to be able to exert control over the divine. Folks, that is not praying. In fact, praying, more often than not, if we're approaching it correctly, is just as much like it's more about exerting control over our own hearts and submitting our own hearts and desires to the control of God. It's giving control to Him, not taking control from Him. So Jesus warns us not to pray like the hypocrites. But He also treats prayer a little differently than He does giving to the poor or fasting. He spends a little bit more time with praying, and then actually goes through the effort of giving us an example to follow in prayer. And why is that? Why would He spend so much more time with prayer than He does giving to the poor? Well, probably, and I think we said this last week, probably because giving to the poor and fasting are both pretty straightforward physical activities. Like giving to the poor, you just whip out your checkbook and there it goes, right? Fasting, you just stop eating. It's a pretty straightforward process. But it's not the case with prayer. Prayer is not merely a physical activity. It's a little less concrete than that. And to be honest, there's a lot of bad examples out there when it comes to praying. A lot of bad examples that flow out of really bad theology. And so Jesus, not one to leave us on our own, to figure out something so important, steps in to give us some help. So with that as kind of our reminder of last week and backdrop, let's step into the actual prayer that Jesus gives. Now, when we reference this, we often refer to it as the Lord's Prayer. And while that is a fitting title in many ways, it's also can be a little bit misleading if we're not careful. Because Jesus is not here praying a prayer that we should repeat ourselves necessarily. Now, there's nothing wrong with repeating prayers. Just go on record. There's nothing wrong with repeating this prayer. As a matter of fact, in Luke chapter 12, or Luke chapter 11, when he gives this very similar prayer to his disciples, he actually says, when you pray, say this. So I think there's good reason to actually take these words at times and to make them ours and to pray them ourselves. But here in Matthew, Jesus doesn't say pray these exact words. He says, when you pray, pray like this. Because what this is not so much Jesus here communing with God in this moment as he is teaching us how to commune with God. So when we pray, we can take the words of this prayer and thoughtfully, with understanding, use them as our own words. And that is okay. Jesus says, pray these words. But we should also use it to learn how to develop our own habit of praying. We should use it, in other words, to learn how to pray and not just what to say. Because the irony is, if we're not careful, the very pattern that Jesus gives us to help keep us from long, repetitive, thoughtless praying is the one prayer in the Scripture that we often use as a thoughtless, repetitive prayer. Jesus has given an example that is meant to teach so that we can grow in our own communion with the Lord through prayer. Now, the reason this prayer works as a sample prayer and works so well is that all of the main parts of prayer are here in it. There's adoration. There's submission of our will to God's will. There is confession. There is supplication, which is just a really fancy word for requests. When I have needs, I'm going to bring them to you. They're all here. The prayer breaks down into really three parts. There's an address. Who am I speaking to? And then there are two groups of three requests each. The first three requests relate directly to God and His work, His activity. So, hallowed be your name. Your kingdom come, and your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. The second group of three relate to our daily needs. Give us our daily bread. Forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors, and lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. So there's kind of our structure. We have an address. We have 6 requests. 3 that deal directly with God and His work, and 3 that deal with us and our daily need. All right? So let's talk about this address. Jesus begins this sample prayer with our Father. Our Father. And folks, this has already been kind of a sub-theme to our service this morning, that God is our Father. And I think that this should be way more amazing to us than maybe it first appears. And I think there's a couple of reasons why the fact that God calls Himself our Father, that He is our Father, I think there's a couple of reasons why it doesn't land with us perhaps the way that it should. One reason, I think, is because it's really easy for us to grow accustomed to the idea. It's just normal. If you've grown up in church, we've heard God called Father for most of our lives. And sometimes when things become normal, they lose their impact. So part of our goal this morning is to shed the normalcy of this idea and see it for the brilliance that it truly is. The second reason I think this doesn't really land very well for us anymore is because fatherhood in our society is not necessarily a celebrated position. It's more often demonized than it is lifted up as a privilege or a responsibility that is beneficial. So when God calls Himself our Father, we can actually kind of drag our own baggage of fatherhood into that idea. I can't tell you how many people over the years have told me that they have a hard time relating to God in that way because they had such a negative example in their own dad, or maybe they never even knew their dad and they grew up with very few positive role models in their lives. And so to hear that God is Father can be a kind of a confusing thing. It's supposed to be positive, but something in us feels very negative at the same time. And if we're truly honest, even those who had great fathers realize that those fathers aren't perfect. You can ask my kids. They'll probably tell you I was perfect. And so it's hard to translate what it means that God is our Father and why it's so significant for God to be Father to His people. But here's the thing. All of the confidence that we have that God will hear and respond to us in our praying, and that He will respond out of love and not indifference or frustration, is bound up in these 2 words: our Father. And that we call Him Father tells us that we can come boldly. We can pour out our souls, and we can know that He is going to handle us with the utmost care and protect us with terrible ferocity and provide for us with staggering generosity. Why? Because that's what a father does. And you go, well, that's not my Father. I get it. I understand. But God is in this sense the Father par excellence. There is none other like Him. He is the perfection of fatherhood. And even when He asks us to wait on an answer or closes the door on something we really wanted, we can rest assured that He is acting for our good and will give us all the help we need to accept what He is doing, even to the point of changing our own desires. Listen, sometimes hearing no by God, or sometimes feeling like we're not getting the answer, can be really, really frustrating. But God is such a Father that He doesn't go, no, now sit over there, I'm tired of talking to you, right? I've told you, right? Like, how many times have I told you? You remember Paul? You've come to me 3 times, Paul. I'm tired of it. The answer is no. Stop bugging me, right? It wasn't like that at all, was it? It was like, no. The answer is no, but my grace is sufficient for you. The answer is no, but I will sit with you in your disappointment, and I will provide everything you need to endure what I am asking you to endure. I will be with you. This is the very aspect of our relationship with the Father that Jesus calls our attention to 2 times in this same passage. Back up in verse number 6, he says, pray to your Father who is in secret. In other words, you can't see him, and he will reward you. In other words, instead of asking or seeking reward from men, right, appreciation, approval, or applause, we are to trust that the Lord sees and he rewards. Which also means that we do have to believe that he's going to make it worth your while. And I think sometimes this is hard for us, right? Because sometimes we're so used to checking our own motivations, and there's a sense of like, oh, I don't know, like I should be motivated to God, for God, and like all the other rewards and talk of that like shouldn't even enter the picture. But yet over and over and over again in Scripture, God entices us with the promise of blessing and reward. And that is not just carrot dangled out on a stick to motivate us to do something, but we're never actually going to get to the carrot. God tells us over and over again. Hebrews 11:6 comes to mind here. Without faith it is impossible to please him. For whoever would draw near to God must believe that he exists and that he rewards those who seek him. You want to know what faith boils down to in God's perception? You need to believe that I exist. And then you need to know who I am. And you know who I am the kind of God who rewards. At my right hand there are pleasures forevermore. Right? So I'm struck by how often God entices us with the promise of reward. And how much trouble with sin would we save ourselves if only we believed that he is a rewarder of those who diligently seek him. If only we believed that his rewards were better than whatever the reward is that is being promised to us by this momentary temptation. How much trouble would we save ourselves? Verse number 8, it says, do not be like them, for your Father knows what you need before you ask him. This is similar to what Jesus tells us at the end of chapter 6, when he says, don't be anxious, because you have a Father in heaven, and listen, he's going to take care of you. He's a Father. That's what he does. Or 1 John 3:1, look at what kind of love the Father has given to us, that we should be called children of God. In other words, folks, the fatherhood of God over us is an astonishingly beautiful display of just how much he loves you. And John is like, just you got to see this. You got to see this. Look at this. God, the Holy One, calls us sons. Now listen, I'll say this one caveat here. This kind of childhood is only available through Christ. There's an aspect of the fatherhood of God where he is father to all that he has created. He is father, and he relates to his creation with authority and responsibility. But there is a significant difference between that kind of relationship and the kind of relationship that actually brings you in, puts you at his table, offers you his love, and gives you an inheritance, gives you his name, makes you belong to him as a child. There's a significant difference between those two. And the only way to be transferred from a child who is under authority and responsibility of God to a child who now has a position at the table, an inheritance with God, is through Christ. Galatians chapter 4, very similar to the passage that Trevor read for us earlier. Paul writes and says, but when the fullness of time had come, God sent forth his Son, born of a woman, born under the law, to redeem those who were under the law, so that we might receive adoption as sons. And because you are sons, God has sent his Spirit, the Spirit of his Son, into our hearts, crying, Abba, Father. So you are no longer a slave, but a son. And if a son, then an heir through God. You see the difference? Once you become part of the family, you get to call him Father. You receive an inheritance. There is blessing. And you only become part of the family through adoption. And adoption is accomplished through redemption. And redemption is paid through the blood of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. The Son who died to pay the penalty for your sins, for my sins, so that we could be adopted into the family of God. Folks, that is the gospel. The payment was made by Jesus, who offers it freely as a gift to anyone who will take it by faith, and not by works. So, folks, everything we ask in prayer to God is ultimately dependent upon this reality, that God is our Father. And so he knows what we need, and he desires to answer when we ask. And apart from this relationship, prayer would be as useless as magic. Now, there's been an attempt by many in Christianity to celebrate the fatherhood of God, to re-emphasize this part of his nature. But what tends to happen is that we swing from one extreme over to another extreme, and we end up out of balance in the opposite direction. And so the Lord doesn't stop his address by saying, "Our Father." He continues on with these words, "who is in heaven." Now listen, this is not telling us where God is located. This is not a directional map to find God. This is not opening up Google Maps and dropping a pin and saying, "Here is where you can find God." When Jesus says, "Our God who is in heaven," it's not direction, it is character. We are talking about who this God is. What is he like? So it's very similar to something like Psalm 115 in verse number 3. Our God is in heaven. He does all that he pleases. In other words, this description that our God is in heaven is a description of his authority, of his majesty, of his dominion, of his sovereignty. It does not tell us where God is, but who God is. He is our almighty King. A.W. Pink says this about this particular statement in the Lord's Prayer. He says, "What a blessed balance this gives to the previous phrase. If that, our Father, tells us of God's goodness and grace, this speaks of his greatness and majesty. If that teaches us of the nearness and dearness of his relationship to us, this announces his infinite elevation above us. If the words "our Father" inspire confidence and love, then the words "which art in heaven" should fill us with humility and awe. These are the two things that should ever occupy our minds and engage our hearts. The first, without the second, tends toward unholy familiarity. The second, without the first, produces coldness and dread. But by combining them together, we are preserved from both evils, and a suitable balance is wrought and maintained in the soul as we duly contemplate both the mercy and might of God, his unfathomable love and his immeasurable loftiness. Our Father, who is the majestic King of heaven. Folks, this is the balance we ought to seek. He is our Father, but he is a holy God who sits on his sovereign throne. And that ought to compel us to come into his presence with an awe, with a reverence. I think I mentioned this in the Discovering God Hour last week, but do you remember the story of Esther? See, I think the idea of kingship and awe and reverence, I think that's lost on us a little bit because we have politicians and we elect them, and so then we make fun of them and we turn them into cartoons. And so when it comes to this reverential awe, it's a bit unfamiliar to us. But if you remember the story of Esther, who was a Jew in a foreign kingdom, and the king, Ahasuerus, decides, I'm not pleased with my wife anymore, and he divorces the queen, and now there's a nationwide search for a replacement, and the next American Idol kind of contest, and Esther wins, and she's brought into the king. She is now part of the harem. She is the queen. But then there's this plot that unfolds, and it's a plot by Haman to destroy all of the Jews. And Esther's uncle Mordecai discovers this plot, and he goes to Esther and says, this is on you. Like, perhaps you've been brought into the kingdom for such a time as this. But Esther's like, let's take 3 days, let's fast and pray over this, because I'm not in the time when I can just, like, I'm not sharing the bed with the king at the moment, okay? I don't have his ear, which means I'm going to have to come to him when he's on his throne, when he holds his scepter, and even me, the queen, if I enter and he does not accept, I could lose my life. And folks, I think that helps us to give some idea of what it means for even those in close relationship to the king to come before someone who holds dreadful authority over you. Now, thankfully, our God is not a capricious, evil king like Ahasuerus. He is loving and he is kind, and we do have bold entrance into him. But I don't think we should forget that yes, he is our Father, but he is also sovereign over the universe. We need to take that seriously. And I'm not sure we often do. We would do well to consider the admonition of Scripture to fear the Lord. And in the fear of the Lord, there is the beginning of wisdom. We're not cowering in a corner because we're afraid of his judgment. We are stepping boldly into his presence because of the blood of Christ. But we remember who he is. This is the same God who when Isaiah gains a vision of him, or when John gains a vision of him, or when Daniel gains a vision of him, these men fall as dead men face down on the ground. They cry out in terror, "Woe is me." And maybe you had no idea that praying involves so much theology. This is the part of praying that we call adoration. And adoration is a way of expressing honor to God for who he is, or what is true about him. It's a way of acknowledging truth about him, which honors him and realigns us to the reality of who he is. And adoration can be accomplished just as simply as speaking truth back to God about himself. God, I know this is true. I know you are my Father. I know you're in heaven. I know you're my King. I know you are sovereign. I know you are righteous. I know you are faithful. I know you are generous. I know you are kind. I know you are compassionate. I know you are just. How many are the ways in which we could just speak back to God the things that are true about him and adore him in our praying. Our Father who is in heaven. And now comes the petitions. And I have like 15 minutes to cram in 6. So he begins with, hallowed be your name. This is the first request. This idea of hallowed is not familiar to us. It basically means let your name be treated as holy. And again, you know from some of our other studies that a name in Hebrew idea, it's conveying much more than just what do I call you. It's actually conveying something of the character of that individual. And so this is a request, an expression of our desire that God be treated as holy because he is holy. And folks, if we just pause right here for a moment, how different is this already from some of our praying? It's already full of profound theology, and now the very first request isn't for a good day or a good meal, but that God's name would be treated and reverenced as holy. Folks, the first concern in our praying should be God and not us. And listen, this is not just about praying that the people out there would shape up and get right with God, okay? Like God, would you make your name holy to all those heathens out there that are currently not hallowing your name? This is actually a request that God would help me to treat his name as holy, which means it's not just a request on our part, it is also a commitment. Listen to what Thomas Manton was a Puritan preacher. This is what he said about this particular request. He says, in this petition, the glory of God is both desired and promised on our part. For every prayer is both an expression of a desire and also an implicit vow or solemn obligation that we take upon ourselves to do what we ask. Prayer. It is a preaching to ourselves in God's hearing. We speak to God to warm ourselves, not for His information, but for our edification. So when we say, Lord, hallowed be your name, we're not just saying, there's a bunch of wicked people out there who are not following and not obeying. We're going, Lord, this is my responsibility. I bear your name. Don't let me treat it as unholy. Don't let me take your name. Do not let me walk under the banner of your name and cause it to be viewed as something empty or valueless or average or normal. Help me by the way I walk in this life to treat your name as holy. Folks, this request should be a top priority of ours in our praying because the glory of God is His priority as well. And so then with this as the first and primary request, the rest of the requests all provide the means of accomplishing the first. Make your name glorious. Make it holy. How is that going to happen? We have 5 more requests to go. Your kingdom come. Your kingdom come. This is looking forward to the coming of the kingdom of God and all the blessings of Christ's rule upon the earth. It's a prayer that Christ would return and set this place right, which, by the way, we're going to say, Christianity sometimes gets accused of being escapism. Like you talk to some Christians like, I just can't wait to get out of this place. Listen, Christianity is not escapism. We're not just waiting on Christ to come and take us out of here. We are ultimately waiting on Christ to come and fix it. Right? We are waiting for the Almighty God. We are waiting for the wonderful Counselor. We are waiting for the one upon whom the government rests on His shoulder to come and rule in righteousness over this place. We are not escapists. We are full of hope and a better future. But I think there's also here a more immediate application. We're not just looking forward to when Christ will come. But there is for everyone today an opportunity through the cross of Christ to be transferred from the kingdom of darkness into the kingdom of light. In other words, the kingdom has come for you now, and so it can sweep you up into its borders, and you can begin to live out the kingdom on earth. You can experience the blessings of the kingdom now. And so Ephesians chapter 2, verse 5 says, by grace you have been saved and raised up with Him and seated with Him in the heavenly places in Christ Jesus. In other words, the throne of Christ is real for us now. The reality, the benefits, and the blessings of His kingship are ours to enjoy, even while we wait for its final form to be realized, to be consummated on the earth. Your kingdom come. There is in some ways, folks, I think an implicit request here that more people be swept up into the kingdom, that more hearts be ruled by Christ now, even while we wait. And then He follows up with, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. This request flows from the second, your kingdom come. What does that look like? Well, part of what it looks like is that the will of God is accomplished fully, completely, immediately, and with joy. Because that's how it's done in heaven. The will of God is not burdensome to the angels. It is a joy. I would just say very quickly, that because sometimes when we talk about the will of God, it gets very ethereal, it gets very confusing. We stress out about it all the time. And can I just say that basically, there are 2 parts to God's will. One is His sovereign will, which means that there is nothing that happens on this earth that does not happen outside of His permission. So when Satan comes to God to afflict Job, he's got to come and ask, right? Like, God, you won't let me touch him. No wonder he serves you. He cannot do anything of his own desire, of his own will, of his own accord. Or when Jesus speaks to Peter, it's like, Peter, Satan has requested to sift you like wheat. Why? Because Satan has to ask. Satan is a roaring lion, but he is chained by the sovereign will of God. Sovereignty is the future. Sovereignty are things that are outside of my control. But then there's this aspect of the will of God that is His moral will. What does God desire us to be? What does He desire us to do? And this is the part that is generally not followed at all on this earth. In fact, only those who have been adopted into His family can actually fulfill the moral will of God. But here's the reality. Here's the thing. We tend to stress over the wrong will. We spend so much time wondering and worrying about things that are out of our control, things that are mysteries, things that are future, like who will be the president? Or who should I marry? Or should I marry? Or where am I going to live? Or what am I going to do for a living? We spend so much time worrying about things that are outside of our control. And so little time worrying about the things that God has actually asked us to consider, to focus on, and to do. Psalm 131, verse 1 says, O Lord, my heart is not lifted up, my eyes not raised too high. I do not occupy myself with things too great and too marvelous for me. What are things that are too great and too marvelous for me? The future. That is mystery that God has not revealed. Presidential elections. That's too great and too wonderful. I can't change it. The psalmist is saying, I don't get swept up into those things. It's not that they're unimportant. But I don't get swept up. I don't occupy my mind with those things. But instead, I have calmed and quieted my soul like a weaned child, a satisfied child with its mother. Like a weaned child is my soul within me. This is why Jesus says, hey, take no thought for tomorrow. No, don't be anxious about tomorrow. That's not for you. You seek first my kingdom, and I will add all these things to you. I will take care of tomorrow. I will provide for your needs. You seek my kingdom. Leave sovereignty to me, right? You focus on obedience. You focus on your walk with me. We spend an inordinate amount of time and energy worried about the future we can't control, and very little time worried about the will of God that He's actually asking us to focus on today. So we got the first three requests, focusing on God and His qualities, His praiseworthiness, making requests that focus on God's glory. If you notice in these requests, it's your, right? Your kingdom come, your will be done, your name be hallowed. But now we come to a portion of the prayer where it becomes us. Right? Here's some things that we need, that we desire of you. Give us this day our daily bread. I love what the theologian Don Carson says. This is a prayer for our needs, not our greeds. It's a prayer for our needs and not our greeds. It's a request that the Lord meet the needs that we have for this day. And I think this teaches us three things. Some have suggested that the reason this need leads this second group, right? It's the first one mentioned of our needs. And some have said the reason why it's the first one in this list of three is because we need food not only to live, but we need food to serve the Lord. And I know some of you know this much more clearly now because you fasted with us the last few weeks. And you know, come like Wednesday afternoon, serving the Lord gets really hard. Why? Because my physical needs start to get in the way and you just want to curl up on your bed and I can pray, but that's all I can do right now. In other words, here's the thing, folks. We are taught by the Lord to come and ask that He might give us what we need, even to enable our service to Him. How gracious, how kind, that He remembers that we are human and that we have human needs, rather than just sitting back and admonishing us for having them. He actually satisfies them. You ever thought about that? You ever sit back and just, I don't know, I get fascinated sometimes by Greek, the Greek theology, their pantheon of gods, the Roman pantheon of gods, and those gods were always irritated with humanity. They were just so needy. It was always in the way. We're just here to do all the work so the gods don't have to work. But then we have to eat and all this stuff, and it's just such a human thing. It's so below us. Maybe our God is not that way. Have you ever contemplated Ecclesiastes chapter 3? The author says, I perceived that there is nothing better for mankind, okay, ladies, than to be joyful and to do good as long as they live. Also, that everyone should eat and drink and take pleasure in all of his work. This is God's gift to man. And how different is our God than the gods of human imagination, that look at our human needs as such a frailty, such a weakness, such a bother. But our God desires and longs to meet and to satisfy our needs. Second thing this part of the prayer teaches is that when we are completely dependent on the Lord, we are completely dependent on Him, so don't allow your full pantry to cause you to forget that. We live in an era of such blessing that it's easy to forget that we live day by day out of the abundant provision of our God and not out of the abundant provision of our employer or the abundant provision of our roaring economy or the abundant provision of Publix. We live out of the abundant provision of our God, and sometimes when we can just go to the refrigerator and open it up and have whatever we want in the moment, we forget that we live according to the abundant provision of our God. The third thing I would say this teaches us is it's not just me, right? Do you notice Jesus doesn't say, give me my daily bread? He says, give us our daily bread. And folks, I think by his very wording, Jesus is teaching us the rule of love amongst his people. That we should love our neighbor as we love ourselves. That we should take their needs to the Lord with the same regularity and the same fervor that we bring our own needs. And that's going to characterize each of these last three requests. Give us our daily bread. Forgive us our trespasses. Lead us not into temptation. It teaches something of the rule of love amongst God's people. The second thing he says is forgive us our debts as we have forgiven our debtors. Which reminds us that as good as food is, it's not enough. The physical satisfaction of our stomachs is not enough. Being human means we have both physical and spiritual needs, and the physical is pretty important. We shouldn't downplay necessarily the physical needs. But the spiritual is eternal. And what we need is forgiveness of our debt, right? He calls it our debt. That's a reminder of what our sin causes. It causes debt that we owe to God and can never pay. But Colossians 2 says, in you, who were dead in your trespasses and this uncircumcision of your flesh, God made alive together with him, having forgiven us all our trespasses by canceling the record of debt that stood against us. We could spend an entire Sunday just minding what that means. He doesn't ask us to pay for it. He doesn't ask us to earn it. He doesn't ask us to work it off. He just canceled it. Why? Because he's already made the payment. It's already available through the blood of Christ. I know some people are troubled by the implication that Jesus is making here by tying our forgiveness of other people to God's forgiveness of us. Right? That comes out very clearly in verses 14 and 15. If we refuse to forgive other people, then God will not forgive us. It's going to hinder your prayers and even prevent you from receiving God's forgiveness. I don't have a ton of time to work all this out other than to say this. Maybe we can talk about this later. But I think there is something in the heart of a believer, folks, who has experienced God's full and free pardon that recognizes the beauty of forgiveness and desires to share that beauty and to enjoy it with other people. And so if I withhold forgiveness from someone who has hurt me, violated me, and I refuse it, what I'm essentially saying is that forgiveness is really unwise. Forgiveness is really, it's kind of foolish. It's going to make me too miserable. And so we're making a determination about the value of forgiveness. And how hypocritical then for us to turn around and ask God to do what we have already determined to be too foolish. There is something in the heart of a believer that has received the forgiveness of God for the unpayable debt that we owed him, that then opens up, unlocks within us the desire to share that same benefit with other people. It's not to say that forgiveness is always going to come easily. It will not. It is also not to say that forgiveness will be permanent. You're going to have to keep forgiving. What it is saying is that for those who have experienced forgiveness, it should be the desire of our heart to do the same for others. Folks, it goes without saying that it is absolutely critical that we be a forgiving community of faith. The last thing he says, lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. Now, here's the question I have with this. Does this mean, like, why would Jesus ask God not to lead us into temptation? Because doesn't he already not lead us into temptation, right? I mean, James very clearly says, when you are tempted, do not say you're tempted of God, because God does not, he cannot be tempted with evil, neither does he tempt any man, right? You're tempted when your own lusts get enticed by something, right? And then you're drawn away by those. You act on it, it becomes sin, and sin leads to death. So why then would Jesus ask God to do something that he already does not do? Well, let me give you a very simple, what I think is a simple explanation, right? Because what James says is true. God does not tempt, but God does test. And there is a significant difference between the two. Tests in this life can either be pleasurable, they can be enjoyable, or they can be hard and they can be painful. But either way, we're going to run into these tests probably sometimes multiple times a day. Sometimes they're going to be very small. Sometimes they're going to be very large. And when we come to a test that is pleasurable, God has provided for a need, God has done something good, we have delicious food to eat. Which reminds me, we're eating lunch when we're done, so don't run out, right? That kind of test, the test of pleasure, tests us to respond with thankfulness and enjoyment of the good gift that God has given. That's what he wants us to do. If the test is painful, it's hard, we've lost something has been taken from us, then we are to trust God and depend on his grace. However, we have enemies, right? The world, the flesh, and the devil. And those enemies take the tests that God has designed for our good and turn them into temptations. And so when the test is pleasurable, the temptation comes along to not just enjoy the thing, but to worship the thing. To make it the thing that I desire more than God himself, which is why God says you cannot serve God and money. It's not because money is bad. It's not because money is evil. Money is actually very good, right? We're all very aware. Money is a good thing. But the minute I decide to worship money, I will stop worshiping the Lord. I will follow money and I will exclude God. I will desire money and I will desire God less. Money becomes the ultimate thing. So when there is pleasure, the temptation is to take the pleasure, the good thing, and turn it into an ultimate thing, an idol. And when there is pain, the temptation is rather than to trust God, to be angry at God for the loss. So what Jesus is praying here is that our Father would not allow the tests that we face in this life to lead us away into sin. In other words, help us respond correctly to tests. Don't allow us to give in to evil. I think I've said enough, right? So Jesus says, pray this way. Call out to God who is your Father, who is your supreme King. Adore him. Make his glory your priority. Submit to his will. And ask for his help, both for you and those around you. Folks, this is the question we started with last week. How do you pray? We began this series with, do you pray? We followed up with, do you fast? And now we're asking, how do you pray? May we hear and heed the teaching of our Lord.